and I'm just freaking out here. So I quickly run to the back and just get the axe. And
what part of the car was the axe in?
It was on the back.
Okay, why did you do that?
Because I was planning to off Beck.
Planning to off her?
Yep.
With the axe?
Yep. It came to that.
Did you have a reason for that?
No.
This is the murderous confession of Australian teenager Jose Omonte-Extrada. And following his actions not even 24 hours prior, he would rip not one but two holes through the communities of Corn and Port Pirie. But how did we get to his ugly truth? What were his motives? And what were the stories behind his victims? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome back to another video by Coffeehouse Crime. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at the case of Jose Omonte-Extrada. Just to let you know, I post solved, unsolved, and strange cases here on a weekly basis. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. So without any further ado, grab a coffee, pull up a seat, and sit back. This is the case of Jose Omonte-Extrada. It feels like only yesterday that we covered another case from Australia. And although this story takes us back to the land down under, we are far away from its metropolitan cities. Not too far away from the Outback's territory, we find a small town named Corn. Located at the peak of Spencer Gulf and 220 miles north of Adelaide, it's remote enough to be considered, well, remote. Looking at Corn, you'd be forgiven if you thought you'd travelled back in time, as even to this day it still boasts old saloon-style stores with Victorian decks. This old charm makes Corn a popular area amongst tourists, partially as a stopping point between Adelaide and the Flinders Ranges to the north, but also as a place to experience the history of the Great Australian Railway. And it's here in the dusty outback town of Corn that we meet Jose Omonte-Extrada, a 19-year-old state emergency service worker. Jose had spent most of his childhood in Australia. However, he wasn't actually born here. The young man was actually born in Bolivia on November 5th, 1993, and unfortunately, he was born into poverty. Now, poverty alone is a lot to deal with for a young child, but Jose also had deep family struggles while growing up. Jose's mother was a well-known alcoholic and drug addict, and to add to this, she was extremely promiscuous. On its own, this isn't necessarily a problem, but his mother would often leave her children alone for several days at a time. A tough start to life, and to add to this, Jose had no reliable father figure either. His biological father, Eli, had left the family to move to Australia soon after his birth, not to be seen again for several long years. In the absence of any parental figures, Jose had to learn how to fend for himself the hard way, and whenever his mother was away, Jose would scrounge and beg for food from his neighbours. When his mother finally returned, Jose was often shouted at and beaten. It took 8 long years for authorities to get involved, and when they finally did, he was removed from his mother and placed into an orphanage. He never saw his mother again. Luckily, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, as less than 1 year later, Jose's father Eli had returned to Bolivia from Australia, where he then finally tracked down his son at the orphanage. Eli and his new partner Tyler Kramer arranged to take Jose back to Australia with them, and with that said, the small family moved to Alice Springs, a small town found near the very centre of the country. This would be the first time in Jose's life where he had any form of stability. It wouldn't be easy settling in, however, as Jose spoke very little English and found it very hard to connect with his newfound family and those around him. Just as Jose was beginning to get comfortable and make local friends, Eli and Tyler decided to move down south to the town of Corn. The move wouldn't go down well with Jose. He wasn't ready to be uprooted yet again in his life. Jose found it harder to make friends as he moved into teenagerhood, and with that said, he became more isolated and more withdrawn. A never-increasing sense of anger filled him, and the contrast between his environment and himself became much more apparent. While he was interested in art, sport, and alternative music, the other boys in Corn were much more into farms and dirt bikes, both of which were not desired by Jose. Jose began to distance himself from his entire family, and he seemed to become more resentful towards his father and stepmother, as in his mind, they seemed to prefer spending all of their time with Tyler's 2 sons. And unfortunately, the distance from his family became extremely apparent at the age of 15. Perhaps something even scarier than murder, but his father was tragically diagnosed with a brain tumour, and unfortunately, it was terminal. Jose hardly reacted when he heard the news. I mean, perhaps this was his way of coping. Maybe he didn't know how to process his emotions. Or maybe he just simply didn't care. Just 2 months after his diagnosis, Eli sadly passed away. At his father's funeral, Jose mostly hid his emotions, but this was the only time anyone would ever see him cry, and it was only once. After his father's death, Jose's behaviour deteriorated quite violently. He would often shout at his stepmother Tala, and even throw plates and smash items around her. His bad behaviour had reached new heights when he and a few other kids broke into a local shop and thoroughly vandalised the place. And as expected, this held serious consequences for the young man. Jose was arrested and eventually released on bail. However, he would never return to his previous home. Tala could no longer look after Jose. He was out of control, and she feared for her own and her children's safety. Instead, he went to stay with Quentin and Margaret Smith, a Christian couple with 2 sons. They were far stricter than his previous family, but at least they began to spend more time with Jose. This stability seemed to help him, and over the course of a year, he became much more focused on his schoolwork and acted out much less than before. And one main reason for this was the relationship that Jose had developed with Quentin Smith. Jose grew to view him as a father figure, and even more so than his actual father Eli. Mrs. Smith was also a very positive influence over the young man. She worked for the state's emergency service and even suggested to Jose that he could join her. This work was healthy for him. Jose had routine, discipline, and found himself to properly connect with the community around him. But 1 year later, all of this would come crashing down, as, out of the blue, Quentin Smith would suddenly pass away. This was the last straw for Jose. After Quentin's death, he completely withdrew from society. He wouldn't socialise, he wouldn't bathe, he wouldn't dress his bed, and he wore his clothes for weeks at a time. Jose began to spend the entirety of his life online, finding his release on the internet. He posted various artworks and poetry to his Facebook account, but the content of his work certainly disturbed his family. His art depicted bloody and violent scenes, often involving women in distress, all of which alarmed his family, who were all extremely Christian. They asked him to remove several Facebook posts, including a picture of himself dressed as Jason from Friday the 13th, and an image of himself holding a knife to a girl's throat titled, "Tim is now single." His interest in violence alienated Jose from those around him, and instead he made several friends online as he felt he could relate to them more. One of these friends was 15-year-old Rebecca Wild from Port Pirie. Rebecca was an alternative teenager going through her formative years. She was funny, friendly, and genuine, and eventually her and Jose began to talk on Facebook very often. They related to each other's taste in music and both enjoyed creating art and photography. And sharing their art online, a few surviving pieces can still be found on their DeviantArt accounts today. Their interactions online were mostly of Jose trying to appease Rebecca, and in the year 2011, she was only 15. On the other hand, Jose was 18, but despite the age gap, he had grown quite a crush on the young girl. So let's talk about Jose's and Rebecca's relationship. Moving into the year 2012, it had progressed from the occasional comment into conversations each and every day. As like many teenagers, Rebecca often vented her frustrations and thoughts online. She complained that she was unhappy at home, had no friends, and was bullied. A situation that Jose felt he could relate to. Jose reassured her on the daily, and it seemed his romantic efforts wouldn't go to waste either. However, it seemed he may have got more than he'd bargained for. The pair finally met in person that June in Port Pirie, all while Jose was on an SES training course. This initial meeting went very well, and it brought the two of them even closer together, prompting Jose to make another trip down to Port Pirie to meet her at home. Despite not having a driver's license, he drove down in the Smith family's car to see Rebecca for a second time. The two got takeaway and watched Nightmare on Elm Street before ending the night with a kiss. From here on out, the relationship turned full throttle, which actually wasn't what Jose had bargained for. Rebecca wanted to become Facebook married, and wanted to seriously commit to the young man. Things became too much for Jose when Rebecca asked him if she wanted a baby with him. There was no way that he wanted a kid with a 16-year-old girl. Communication between the two began to destabilize after this. The misfit couple were clearly misaligned, and considering the implications involved, maybe their relationship should have stopped here. But unfortunately, 2 weeks later, Jose decided to kickstart their relationship again. And even more so, a big surprise to Rebecca, he wanted to meet up in person. This was very sudden and out of the blue, but in Rebecca's mind, she loved Jose. She therefore agreed to meet him in a local area. On December the 5th, 2012, Jose walked to his workplace, the emergency service station, and stole one of the Toyota Utes used for surveying. He placed an emergency service kit behind his seat, and inside lay a knife and an axe. Dressed in an Iron Maiden shirt, black jeans and heavy boots, Jose then pulled away, and his destination was Rebecca. Driving down to Port Pirie, Jose asked Rebecca to meet him at a local memorial park, and after making the 80-mile journey to meet her, the two found each other as planned. Rebecca stepped into the truck, and driving away, Jose tried to find somewhere quiet and private so they could hash things out. While driving, the pair began to talk. Jose shared that he wasn't looking for anything too serious, and all in the meanwhile, Rebecca accused Jose of leading her on, that he was simply trying to sleep with her and nothing else. Jose already had harrowing plans, but Rebecca's next surprise would do more to motivate him. It was during this talk that Rebecca let slip that she was already seeing other guys since Jose had left her. And even though Jose had claimed he didn't want a relationship, this new information enraged him. Only minutes into the argument, he snapped. Reaching behind the seat, he tucked his hand into the emergency service kit. Grasping the wooden handle of the knife, Jose began to furiously stab Rebecca across her arm. And in fact, all of this was while driving. He delivered a total of 29 stab wounds to her right arm and shoulder. Rebecca cried out in pain, begging him to stop and to take her to the hospital. But Jose refused. He knew doing this would mean many years behind bars. And tragically, keeping her alive was also the entire opposite to his plan, which as of right now, was to continue driving her north. With Rebecca falling in and out of consciousness, Jose proceeded to drive 90 miles north of Port Pirie. This would take him back to Corn, through the main street and then further north. He then found a secluded road and finally stopped the car. Jose then got out of the ute, walked to the boot, and began to shuffle items around in the back. He was looking for something to cover Rebecca's body with after the deed was done. That was when he heard a sudden thud. In her state of semi-consciousness, Rebecca had managed to climb out of the truck and was now attempting to crawl away. Sadly, this didn't work. She was then grabbed by Jose and hoisted back into the passenger seat. However, his efforts were then interrupted by the headlights of an incoming vehicle, and getting closer, it stopped in front of his ute. Behind the wheel was 22-year-old Jessie Fullerton, a local woman famous in the area as the Camel Jockey. In fact, Jose recognised her from his drinking sessions at the local hotel. Jessie climbed out of the vehicle. She was a small woman, and this was due to her diagnosis of dwarfism, which Jessie never let hold her back. Immediately after stepping out of her vehicle, she knew something was very wrong. Jose was shifty. Shouting towards Jessie, he reassured her that everything was fine, and he was just out for a late night drive. But Jessie could see a figure in the passenger seat, so she knew that Jose was not alone. Small in stature, Jessie had a very self-assured personality. She courageously walked up to the vehicle, ignoring her gut feeling. After opening the passenger door, the horrific sight of Rebecca, half-conscious and covered in blood, came to her attention, and shouting to Jose, she asked him what had he done. In the midst of her sudden panic, Jose had walked to the back of the truck and pulled out the axe he had prepared earlier. With Jessie's back turned, Jose lifted the axe above his head. He struck Jessie a total of 7 times, and, tragically, this ended her life. Witnessing the murder of Jessie, Rebecca began to scream, and in a panic, Jose climbed back into the ute and made a U-turn. Speeding off, he left Jessie on the side of the road, only 100 meters from her own home. All while driving, Jose then reached back behind himself, picked up his axe, and then struck Rebecca in the side of her head. And after several strikes, Jose was sure that she was dead. Pulling over several minutes later, he dragged Rebecca's body out of the ute, covered her with a blanket, and dumped her wrapped body in a bush. Throughout this carnage, Jose was now panicking from his own actions. Although he planned to kill Rebecca, Jessie's death was never part of the plan, and technically, he was now a spree killer. Jose then attempted to cover his tracks. He drove back towards the SES station, stopped at Jessie's truck along the way to turn it off, and took the keys. He then spent 3 hours cleaning the truck before grabbing a shovel and a can of petrol, and after returning to Rebecca's body, he then set it alight. Anyone can tell you that burning a body takes a lot of heat and a lot of time, and Jose's fire burnt out very quickly. In a state of panic, further disrespect, and sheer stupidity, He then tied Rebecca's remnants to the back of the truck and dragged her burnt body along the road to Corn Cemetery. He then dug a shallow grave and buried Rebecca in it. After this, and as the sun began to rise, Jose returned to the SES station, returned the truck, walked home, jumped into bed, opened Rebecca's phone, and deleted all contact history between them. And at 6 AM on December the 6th, 2012, exhausted from a night of murdering 2 innocent women, Jose went to sleep. 4.5 hours later at 10:30 AM, Jose was awoken by a gentle shake on the shoulder. It was his foster mother, Margaret. She wanted to ask him if he had heard from Rebecca Wild. Rebecca was now missing, and Margaret knew her foster son was good friends with her. To add to this, being part of the State Emergency Service, it was also now her job to help find Rebecca. Deceptively, Jose acted puzzled and lied. He insisted he had not been in contact with Rebecca for quite some time, and that he hoped they would find her very soon. After Margaret walked out of the room to leave Jose alone, he jumped out of bed, before unscrewing a cabinet in his bedroom wall and hiding Rebecca's phone and Jessie's keys inside. Shortly after this, his mobile phone rang, and on the other end was Rebecca's mother. She knew that her daughter had been in a lengthy relationship with Jose, and now she was looking for help. Again, Jose lied. He claimed that he hadn't seen or spoken to Rebecca for a couple months now. A rather odd thing to ask, but Rebecca's mother asked Jose for his Facebook password. And to make this more bizarre, he actually gave her the password before ending the call, only to then rush to his computer and change it. By now, messages from several friends of Rebecca were popping up, all asking him if he knew where she was. Jose was now in hot coffee, as several accusations were now coming his way. He dressed into his orange State Emergency Service uniform and headed out to join the masses that were now looking for the teenager that he had murdered. But after arriving at the station, it was clear that Jessie Fullerton's body had already been discovered. Everyone was on high alert. They all knew that now they had a murderer amongst their community. Jose expected that by joining the search for Rebecca, the suspicion going around him would be calmed. He was, however, gravely mistaken. Rebecca's mother found everything about Jose extremely suspicious, as despite him claiming that he hadn't seen Rebecca for a while, she knew they had met just the very night prior. Rebecca's mother passed this information on to the police, and they wasted no time in finding Jose to question him. Of course, he would deny these claims, but his story was weak and unbelievable. The officers asked him if they could search his house, in which reluctantly he obliged, and while there, Jose would eventually see Rebecca's parents pulling up to his house. He knew that his weak story and multiple mistakes would cost him dearly. It was only a matter of time. The pressure was too much, and eventually, Jose made the decision to come clean. He calmly asked to speak to Sergeant Ranger, a man that he knew on the force, and while here, he told the full story of what actually happened to Rebecca and Jessie. Sergeant Ranger had actually recorded the whole thing, and in this video, Jose can be seen confessing to his crimes so neutrally, and without any emotion.
Want to slip your shoes off?
Where did you kill Rebecca?
Where's scene 2 is.
Where the second scene is?
Yep.
Okay. What did you actually do there
What do you mean?
to kill her?
Well, I pulled her out of the car.
Yeah. This is, we're talking about Rebecca now?
Yeah.
Okay. And hit her with the axe?
Yeah.
Okay.
After confessing to officers, Jose was arrested, escorted off the premises, and eventually taken to the multiple crime scenes that he'd created. While here, he was asked why he killed Rebecca and Jessie, in which he flatly replied, "I have no idea."
Where was that?
That was in Peary.
In Port Pirie?
Yeah.
Okay. Why did you do that?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Jose showed no emotion, no remorse, he bared no tears. He simply accepted his own actions. Throughout court proceedings, his lack of emotions persisted. Jose simply did not care about taking the lives of 2 innocent women.
Have you ever suffered from any like mental health problems or psychological problems or anything like that?
What do you mean?
Depression, anything like that?
You know, I was depressed at the time when, a few years ago, but, you know, that's as far as I know that I've, you know, any close to anything.
So what do you think's caused what's happened yesterday?
I honestly have no idea. Like, I've tried to recall what my thoughts were at the time, but
Yeah.
or even, you know,
Just anger?
kind of anger, but not so much anger. I had no anger towards Jess because, you know, I had, you know, she was a very, you know, great person.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Moving into court, Jose sat through more than 30 victim impact statements. These were from the family and friends of his victims, and still, he showed no regret or emotion. When he was asked if he wanted to say anything to the grieving families, he simply said nothing. Quite obviously, Jose had a severe lack of empathy that was bordering on the realm of sociopathic. He knew what he did was wrong, he just didn't care.
And I'm just freaking out here, so I quickly run to the back and just get the axe. And
What part of the car was the axe in?
It was on the back. I'll put it in there
Okay.
prior to going to Perry,
Okay. Why did you do that?
because I was planning to off Beck.
Planning to off her
Yep,
with the axe.
yep. If
Okay.
it came to that.
Did you have a reason for that?
No.
In the psychological assessments of Jose Omonte-Extrada, forensic psychologist Luke Broomhall found his personality was shaped almost from birth by the difficult, neglectful and abusive upbringing that his mother had put him through for the first 9 years. He was likely to be a socially isolated individual who has a few interpersonal relationships that could be described as close and warm. Jose Omonte-Extrada was ultimately sentenced to 2 life sentences. He was given the possibility of parole after serving 33 years behind bars, and this means that Jose would be the age of 53 before he tastes freedom again. Jailing him for 33 years in prison, Supreme Court Justice Trish Kelly told him he had a chilling sociopathic disregard for his victims. In the summer's evening of December 2012, and yes, I said summer because this is Australia, Jose had planned to take 1 life. But in a tragic twist of events, this intention would ultimately lead to 2. Jessie Fullerton's courage and kindness would ultimately conclude her untimely end. She stopped for Jose thinking maybe he needed her help. She was a kind and self-assured young woman who went through many health problems in her life. Her grandfather would say that she always wore a smile through it all. After all, she was one of the strongest people that he knew. Jessica was following in her grandfather's footsteps to become a professional camel jockey, and she loved to take care of all the animals on the family ranch. Moving forward, she will be dearly missed. While Jessie was killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, Rebecca was murdered with intention and anger. She was just a young girl finding her feet, who trusted the man she considered as a friend and a lover. And despite this, he would find the audacity to kill her. It is a sad and tragic story that these 2 young women were lost to the world by an evil and isolated young man. Their deaths were entirely senseless, and they leave behind 2 devastated families. This is yet another frustrating case, and both murders held no logical motive. It is hard to predict if this was avoidable. I mean, in hindsight, Jose clearly had a loose screw or 5, but were the red flags obvious enough? The only obvious factor we can be certain of here is that this case was entirely senseless, and these 2 girls will be dearly missed. And so concludes the case of Jose Omonte-Extrada. Thank you so much for watching today, folks. If you found this case insightful, then please remember to like the video, and if you're interested in true crime, then please consider subscribing too. As always, I'll see you again real soon for another video, but in the meantime, please remember to look after one another. I'll see you again soon. Bye.